Nzinga, thank you very much indeed. Good evening to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on the Full View on the SABC News channel tonight, live from the Wits Business School for tonight's debate about the future direction of our economy and ensuring that we have inclusive growth for all. There can be no doubt about the problems facing our country and our economy. Just yesterday, the World Bank again downgraded our growth forecasts for this year. One of the most important facts in our country is that more than half of the young people in this country are not employed and are not studying. Many of them, we fear, may be actually losing hope of ever getting a job. How do we fix this and how do we do it properly is part of the conversation tonight. Just 4 months ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa promised during his inauguration that he would work to end and to eradicate poverty within a generation. At the same time, there's been a debate, since 1994 and before then, around how best to do that. Do we tackle first poverty and make people richer, or do you work more on the side of reducing inequality? Of course, in South Africa, inequality is really racialized inequality. This is the conversation that you'll be seeing with you here until 8 o'clock tonight on The Full View. It's an intriguing and important lineup of guests this evening. First, you'll see and hear from Anne Bernstein. She is the Executive Director for Development and Enterprise. She'll present her side of this argument. I'm expecting her to concentrate on the side of eradicating poverty. She'll speak for herself for you in a moment. Then you'll hear from Professor Imran Valodia. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management here at Wits University, also the Director of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, serves on the National Minimum Wage Commission, among other bodies as well. I'm presuming that he'll present his argument in favor of concentrating on removing inequality. Again, he'll speak for himself. We have two respondents in today's discussion as well. Momaketi Dejane is a rates and macro analyst at ABSA. She has almost 20 years experience as an analyst in financial markets. She looks at the intersection between public policy, economics, and financial markets. And then Professor Marie Leibrand is a professor in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. He holds a National Research Foundation Chair in Poverty and Inequality Research. He's also the Director of the Southern African Labour and Development Research Unit. He also holds several other posts. That's the conversation that you'll be hearing tonight. Towards the end of the conversation, we will be taking questions here in the hall, and we will hear from you in the audience and give you the opportunity to ask questions as well. The conversation also happening on Twitter. The hashtag we're using is #CriticalConversations, and of course the handle is @FullViewSABC. Right then, let's begin. If I may invite Anne Bernstein from the Center for Development and Enterprise to make her case for growing the economy. Please, let's welcome Anne Bernstein tonight.
Good evening. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Too many South Africans are poor, over half the population. Too many are unemployed, over 10 million people. And too many adults do not have a matric, near to 20 million people. These realities contribute to our especially high levels of inequality. Now, there have been real achievements in the past 25 years of democracy, but South Africa's good story has mainly been about the insiders, people like me and some of you, the people who get jobs, who get reasonable education and training, who are unionized, the deal makers, the tenderpreneurs, the connected people. And we leave behind millions and millions of people who are not educated, who are not part of networks, who live in homes where nobody works and who are themselves unemployed. So what do we do about all of this? Some people say that redistribution is the answer. The fact is that democratic South Africa has built one of the most redistributive states in the developing world. We provide grants for some 18 million people, provide millions of people with housing, healthcare, water, electricity, and many other things free of charge. Our spending on health and education are proportionately to the budget some of the highest in the world. Now, I support the use of public money for redistribution in a country with our discriminatory and apartheid history. But there are limits to how much we can spend on this kind of redistribution. And far too much state spending is wasted, is stolen, or is used inefficiently. In a way, South Africa ameliorates poverty. We administer it, rather than working night and day to create the pathways out of poverty, the social mobility that would enable us to steadily eliminate poverty. As Harvard's Ricardo Hausman has put it, in South Africa, we compensate the poor for their exclusion instead of focusing on more effective methods of inclusion. So what are the most effective approaches to inclusion? How does South Africa achieve inclusive growth? The answer, we believe, lies in making some tough choices about priorities and then really sticking to them and actually implementing them. So the most important priority in our view is faster growth. This is an absolute prerequisite for improving employment, poverty, and inequality. Our economy is in deep, deep trouble and has been for many years now. In our view, the country needs a credible strategy for much faster growth. This strategy must be built on a very different approach to the role of markets and business. Profit is not a four-letter word, and competitive markets can deliver many services more efficiently and affordably than a weak state. We need to be a globally competitive economy, and we need competitive markets internally in large swathes of the public sector, the state-owned corporations, as well as the private sector. We must open up space for new, small, and medium firms to prosper. We need fewer regulations and obstacles that add to business costs. And we should focus on our expanding cities and make sure they become cities of hope, places of access to expanding opportunities for everyone, especially the poor. And we should finally tackle our skills shortage. We need to reform our skills system. We have to grasp the hard nettle, if that's appropriate, of basic education reform. And we have to open the country to as many skilled immigrants, investors, entrepreneurs as we can possibly attract. Sadly, we also have to add to this list that we must deal with the country's debt, which is now so large and rising that it weighs down our chances of growth, faster growth. We have to cut state expenditure, especially the rate at which wages have increased. I think 11% per annum for public sector wages over the last decade is outrageous. We need to make the hard choices about the state-owned companies. We need to appoint world-class people to run Eskom and other big SOCs, and we need to decide that some of them are not going to make it and need to either be privatized or shut down. We have to have a debate about the size of the state. When the state can't fix all the potholes on the way to this debate tonight, and we're struggling with crime at an appalling rate, we need to be realistic about what the state can and cannot do. And that relates to the role of the state-owned companies and their future. And then last but not least, we need to restore the rule of law in South Africa and rebuild critical institutions. My second priority is that we need much faster growth, but this has to be labor-intensive growth. South Africa's development strategy rests on the false hope that increasingly skilled and capital-intensive economy can generate such high growth that unemployment will fall. Well, 25 years on, I think it's reasonable to say this strategy has failed. And it has contributed to our extremely high levels of unemployment and our world-beating rate of youth unemployment. By driving up the risks and the costs of employing people, the implementation of the so-called decent wage or decent work agenda has priced unskilled workers out of the labor market. In the eyes of the policymakers, work that is not decent seems to be worse than no work at all. And the implications is that no wage is seen to be better than a low wage. Now, we have a different view. In our view, South Africa has to attract investment and firms that provide jobs for the labor force we actually have, unfortunately unskilled, mainly inexperienced, unschooled, and not the highly skilled workforce we all wish we had. The South African economy must create more space for labor-intensive industries that use unskilled workers. And in a country like ours, most opportunities for employment, if we are to grow, need to be characterized by relatively low skill and thus lower wages. Now, it would be grossly unjust if low-wage jobs were the end point of a development strategy. But this need not be the case, and it should not be the case. Just look around the world. If you look at China, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Cambodia, and possibly very soon Ethiopia, where I read today, not only are they manufacturing low-skill clothing at low wages, but now an investor is starting 2 manufacturing plants for low-cost cell phones. This experience around the world shows that factory workers, even those who are making my t-shirt, can move from making basic clothes to making Stephen's shirt, much more complicated, and can aspire to manage other workers. These workers save money and start their own small firms. They can spend more money on their children's education, especially the disadvantaged girls. And these firms can access new markets. They don't have to stay at the bottom end of the clothing value chain. They can learn new skills, they can move up the value chain, and they themselves create new opportunities for other firms in the economy and their workers. In order to achieve this much more labor-intensive approach, South Africa needs to make the changes required to encourage employers to want to hire labor and not buy more machines. We need to encourage them to hire younger workers who are inexperienced. We need to make changes to the labor market regime, especially regarding the way it impacts on new firms, on smaller and lower wage employers. And we should experiment. As the Minister of Finance has suggested in his policy paper, we should experiment with new approaches to special economic zones and exports, with a focus on attracting labor-intensive activities from other countries like China. Now let me pull this together. To build a more inclusive country, South Africa needs much faster growth and much more labor-intensive growth. And in our view, in a country with too many laundry lists of priorities, these 2 priorities should trump everything else. We need inclusion in the growth process, more jobs for the labor force we actually have, more opportunities for new firms, for new black entrepreneurs to get into building firms that are small and hopefully one day are medium-sized and bigger. More focus on expanding the skilled workforce we need to grow this economy. We need inclusion in how we spend the taxes we raise from growth. We must cut out waste and corruption in the public sector. And wouldn't it be great if somebody was put in jail? We need to make sure that the millions we spend on education and healthcare are spent well. We need to get value for money. We need to get kids in our schools actually learning. We need to move up the international tables where we swim at the bottom, the very bottom, even below much poorer countries. And lastly, we do need to build a professional state whose reach does not exceed its grasp, and where senior appointments are fit for purpose. Effective redistribution is important, but if there is a trade-off between growth and redistribution, we would favor growth. Why, you might ask, in a country as unequal and poor as this one? Because the long-term benefits of getting growth right far exceed anything that redistribution alone can achieve. The experience of other countries shows that faster growth, more inclusive, labor-intensive growth, can have a revolutionary impact on moving people out of poverty and helping them and their children achieve a better life. And this process of sustained inclusive growth could result in real empowerment and transformation, not just for a small elite, but for millions and millions and millions of South Africans. Thank you.
And Bernstein, thank you very much indeed. You are supposed to clap. If out of politeness rather than any political comment. Anne Bernstein is the Director of the Center for Development and Enterprise. Professor Imran Valodia is our next speaker. I see you already have the microphone, Prof. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management here at Wits University and also Director of the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. Professor, your case.
All right, so I would start from I would start from the premise that we all that we all would like to have growth, but I would like to make the argument that with that growth, in the context that we're in, we have to always be thinking about inequality at the same time. And if we're going to drive a sort of pattern of growth that is going to increase inequality, then we're on a path that is not at all sustainable. And I'm going to try to make that argument. So I want to share two kind of statistics with you. If we take data on kind of how unequal our income is, so the kind of outcome of a growth process is income. We have the highest level of inequality in the world, and that inequality is growing. If we think about the overall amount of wealth in the country, so income tells you how much someone's earning. If we think about the wealth, how much do we all have in assets? Well, the top 10% of those who have wealth own 95% of all of the wealth in South Africa. And I think these are the realities that our growth also has to deal with. So when we talk about economics and we talk about economic strategy, there's a lot about the growth process that I think justifies why certain kind of actors in the economy should benefit from that growth. And if we ask ourselves, how is it possible that we can live in a society where the top 10 where the top 10% own 95% of everything, How is that justified in terms of economics? Well, I want to make the argument that actually it has nothing to do with economics, that those are essentially political choices that we make as a society, and that we have a choice in what those outcomes are. Behind the economics is a kind of set of economic arguments that gets used to kind of justify choices of this sort. So let me give you two examples. Okay? We know from data that we have that if you compare incomes by kind of gender, so men earn something like 20% more than females for doing exactly the same job. So in the labor market now, if you're a man and you're a woman, the man's going to earn 20% more on average for doing exactly the same job. Is that something that we think is justifiable, or is that something that we think needs to be fixed up? I would say our economic strategy has to tackle those issues, and it has to fix it up. Let's just take patterns of pay. So you've all heard about the ShopRite example, right? Let me share it with you again. So the CEO in kind of ShopRite earns something around something around 35 million rand a year. The lowest paid worker in ShopRite earns something around 2,800 rand per month. So it would take the lowest paid worker in ShopRite 50 years of work to earn what the CEO earns in 1 year. Is that something that we think is justifiable? And do we want our growth pattern to be reinforcing patterns of that sort? So there's a lot in kind of economic ideology which tends to justify these types of sort of patterns of ownership. And you'll hear things like this. You'll hear that those who are rich have worked really hard, and that it's kind of justifiable that they should earn these incomes, and that it's kind of justifiable that they should have this wealth. You'll hear arguments like it's fine that we should have such high inequality, because in the end, all of that income is going to somehow trickle down to the poor. And you'll kind of hear arguments that go along this line, that the rich and the wealthy are so smart, and they're so that there's a meritocracy about it, and that it's fine for those for those folk to earn those incomes. Well, if you really unpack it, what is actually happening is that those who kind of have these high incomes send their kids to the best universities, and you're in the self-replicating system where those who earn a lot go on earning a lot. And to my mind, if we go on along this growth pattern, these are the types of things that are going to go on happening. So in my view, we have to have growth, but we also have to deal with these inequalities at the same time. If we don't, then I think politically the system's not going to be sustainable. Kind of South Africans don't remember things for a long time. If we ask ourselves, what are the factors that might give rise to a Zuma administration again? We all get extremely angry about it, but what are the political and the economic factors that give rise to a project of that sort? And to my mind, the inequality that we have is a key driver in why you get political outcomes of that sort. And if we don't deal with the inequality, at some point down the line, we're going to have a repeat of those sorts of systems, because people get really angry about inequality, and when they see the vast amount of wealth that is accumulated by a few, then they tend to vote for folks such as Trump and folks such as Zuma, and that's the political realities that we have to deal with. So then let me come to the economics of the relationship between growth and inequality. We've got a large amount of research on what is the relationship between inequality and growth. And the overwhelming evidence from that is that kind of higher levels of inequality is a dampener on growth. So you're not going to get your economy growing if you're going to have high levels of inequality. So the way to get your economy growing is to deal with the high levels of inequality. And I think we can all accept that we live in a time where technology is kind of having such an impact on our economy that it's likely that patterns of growth that don't by the way they design deal with inequality are only going to generate higher and higher the levels of inequality. So let me then come to some of the challenges we have now. I think we would all agree that the kind of economy is in a mess, and that we face a kind of really serious set of issues. But I think a sort of policy that simply starts to cut large amounts of state expenditure is only going to do two things. It's going to increase inequality, and it's going to decrease the growth rate. So that seems to me something we should not be doing. And I think the types of sort of policies that advocate that are not going to get us out of the problems we're in. There is one area that I strongly agree with Anne. I kind of do think our economic policies really need to create opportunities for many South Africans to enter the economy, and we kind of really need to use policies that deal with those who are excluded. But for me, part of those policies involves dealing with the powerful incumbent firms that stop people from entering the parts of the economy. But I think the kind of area that we probably mostly not in agreement on is that I think you can't, in this society, kind of have an economic policy plan that doesn't have some flaws in your kind of in your society. Economic change is going to generate a large amount of losers in a kind of economy such as the one we have. Those without power are likely to be the ones that would most likely lose. So poor, kind of rural females are likely to be the ones that would lose the most. That's why I think you have to have policies that kind of really establish some flaws to protect those people. And that is why I'm a strong advocate of policies such as minimum wages, because what you do through that is to protect those who don't have power, and slightly alter the balance of power, and give those groups a little more say in what the outcomes of our economy are. I think I've used up my time, so I'll stop there.
You have. In fact, we're pretty much running to time, which is a first for an argument about the economy. Please thank the professor for the contribution. You're with the Full View. It's a special broadcast tonight, live from the Wits Business School. We're talking about the economy, inclusive growth, and we're looking at the argument between concentrating on eradicating poverty, in other words, making people richer, or perhaps more accurately, less poor. And then on the other side, we're looking at reducing inequality, which is the best way forward. That's the conversation that we're having tonight. We've had both sides of the argument already. Let's speak now, and let's hear from our respondents. And our first respondent tonight, you have 10 minutes, Mamaketi, is Mamaketi Dejane from ABSA.
This is a toughish job because there's been a lot that was said by the two speakers. So if I look at it, just reading the topic of the discussion just gave me a headache. So it says, do you want inclusive growth, or do you, how is it framed? The framing is problematic, I think, because it speaks about whether you want growth or you want inequality. And that, for me, if we start talking in those terms as South Africans, we're asking the wrong question. What we want to know is whether we want an inclusive economy. An inclusive economy means that you don't have 4 out of 10 people that would like to wake up in the morning and go to work sitting at home, completely excluded from any economic activity, being recipients of some or other grant, but really not having much say in what happens in their lives. So for me, every time I see this question being framed, it really makes me mad, because I think we're getting all wrapped up in things that matter on some level, but that's not the question. The question is, how do you get those people to live a life of dignity somehow? So for me, that's the first point of departure. And listening to both Imran and Anne, there's a lot of overlap for the very reason that we're asking ourselves the same question, we're trying to solve for the same things. There's a lot of overlap in how they would like to see things. All of us would like to see the economy growing, which is the first thing that Imran acknowledged. And then the question then becomes, so what if there's a trade-off between inequality and growth? Which one do you go with? I firmly believe that when you have the kind of labor participation that you have in South Africa, if you get more people working, you will get growth. So the question is, do you get growth and then get employment? The thing is, the thing that will actually get this economy growing is to get more of its people more productive. To have the level of economic participation that we have in a country, it makes no sense. It's a complete waste of a resource. And I think this is one of the big arguments that the NDP, for instance, makes, which gets neglected often. So the question is not whether you need to get growth to get employment. Actually, you've already got the people there. You just need to get them working, and you will get growth. And then the next question becomes, well, is that growth going to be equal, unequal? And Imran makes a compelling case for the status quo and why the way we are currently, the status quo is not sustainable. So I agree that the status quo at the moment is not sustainable. But even when he's quoting the stats, he's quoting the insider stats. Because the person who has a job at ShopRite is an insider, and the CEO is an insider. But you're not even talking about people that earn nothing. So what would those numbers look like if you took into account that the outsiders are also part of the economy? And what are the implications of that? So the numbers are worse than what Imran even states, right? Because some people in this economy, a huge chunk, earn 0. So my thing would be, maybe the question would be to ask, if you were to get those people working not in indecent jobs. So the whole thing about what is a decent job and what is not a decent job, I think on some level, you're almost saying you 40% of the population, you're not working. We don't care what you think is a decent job for you. So we're actually taking away your agency. So you don't get to say what it is that you're willing to accept. I think there is a big argument to be made for having some standards and having some policies that protect workers from abuse. But I'm not sure that a wage of 2,500 for a person who would otherwise be earning zero, for an employer who has a really good reason for why they pay that. Maybe they're a small business. In that instance, I'm not sure that 2,500 is a bad wage if all the other conditions of employment are met. I'm just saying that the discussion is going to be opened up a little bit. So that would be my sort of takeaway, or my sort of first criticism to Imran's point. And on Anne's point, the idea that if you had to have a trade-off between inequality and growth must always win. The thing about it is that, why do you have an economic system that is biased towards creating economic gains that are not equally shared? That's the question that you should be asking yourself. Not whether when you have to make now this choice, which choice are you going to be making? And I think that's a question that everybody in the world is asking globally, so it's not unique to South Africa. It's how are the economic rents ultimately distributed? So for me, it is another one of those that's just a red herring. It's just like, oh, we like our system the way it is. We want to keep it the way it is. Otherwise, if you don't give us this thing, you're not going to get growth. No. For me, why is that even on the table? There is justice and there is injustice. And what is happening at ShopRite, for instance, as Imran said, for me, it's not just. So you need to deal with it. So I'm saying, deal with the same, these are all problems, but deal with them individually. The first question is, how do you make sure that 4 out of 10 South Africans are not sitting at home and not at work? That, to me, is paramount. And if you get those people at work, GDP will follow. So therefore, I don't see what this whole question about whether you get GDP or not. What it is actually is a political choice. I agree with Imran there. It's a political choice about what kind of growth are you going to follow and which lobbies within the system are you going to honor, and who has more political power. And it's a political decision, and we need to hold our politicians accountable for that. But this of us arguing about things that are maybe not even necessarily in conflict, I think we're just wasting a lot of time having fights that are maybe, not that they're not meaningful, but maybe we're not as against each other as we think we are.
Unity breaking out in a conversation around the economy. All right, we continuing your conversation, taking live here on the Full View on SABC from the Wits Business School. Mamoketi, thank you very much indeed. Wasn't that a good response? I mean, under pressure? If we're going to ask someone to beat it, he better be a professor. Professor Murray Leybrandt is from the University of Cape Town at the School of Economics there. Professor, your thoughts on the debate so far, please.
What Mamoketi said. In a slightly more long-winded way, as befits a professor. So I had the same point, that this counterposition of growth, poverty and inequality is as if you can choose in a social welfare function between how much growth you want and how much versus inequality, and there's a trade-off. That's not where contemporary social analysis is, and it's not where contemporary economics is. I think that the development economics is talking right now about growth, poverty, and inequality as a triangle that intersects, in the sense that they're all part of the same social processes. And in particular, a growing realization from everybody, I would be tempted to say, that very high levels of inequality represent a society that's distorted, that can't reach its full potential. So inequality hampers growth, as Imran said. But then, of course, the lack of growth stifles the ability of a society to overcome inequality as well. And so clearly in the South African case, we have a mission. The South African project has to be directed at transforming our society, and that has to mean bringing down this inequality that's higher than anywhere else in the world, in any dimension you want to look at. That includes at the household level. It includes in the labor market, though, even with those who just have a job. That's a problem, and it's not part of the South African project. But the point that I want to emphasize is that also hampers growth. It's not just a decision that we don't want a society like that. There's lots of literature about the fact that inequality represents foregone productivity and a stifling of the society. And I think that, so it's a sort of a pragmatic, I think what that means is we often say it's all hands on deck in South Africa, and we often think that there's a leadership failure right now. And we think that we need to have an established vision. What are we aiming for as a society? And I think that this discussion, a rich discussion of growth and poverty and inequality within the aspirations of what we're aiming for would be hugely useful to the society at the current moment. So I'm not arguing that we're choosing, that I favor a focus on inequality rather than poverty, or inequality rather than growth. I'm completely on board with Anne that a social, this part of the South African project is to focus on the marginalized, the bottom end of our society who bear the brunt of everything. What I am saying, though, is that the reproduction of that poverty is part of the growth process that we have in our country, and it's part of our inequality. Who has what education, who has what to offer the society. So this point, it's not just an esoteric point, it's a point that's in reality in our economy every day. Let me say a few things about that. I think Mamokgethi very bravely gone to the interface between the unemployed and the employed, and it's a huge problem, and it's a crisis that really does require this all hands on deck. Our society is directed at solving that problem, but that's not stating it as many times as you like is not a solution to it. And what I've heard little of tonight really is the reality of our economy and the growth. So what is the growth process? What do we mean by a growth process? What have we got to work with in our economy every day? And so I just want to make a few points about how the inequality in our economy stifles growth. Let me use the example that Imran raised about the inequality of the earnings distribution. It is world-beatingly high. And when Anne made the point that average wages have risen quite strongly, and when you counterpose that in an easy way between that and our unemployment rate, that's obviously a problem. But what's happened in the earnings distribution in South Africa over the last 15 years is that inequality has gone up. That average is the product of a very thin top end that's done quite well, and a bottom end, a very bottom end that hasn't done, that has preserved their real wages. That doesn't mean they've done well. They're the lowest earners in the labor market, but they're preserved. And then the middle of the labor market has more or less fallen out. So that's the process of growth. The production process is something that's generating that level of inequality. And 2 or 3 years ago, when we were in engagements at the nadir our country, the Zuma era, there was broad recognition from the business community, from business leadership, from everybody, that actually that level of earnings inequality and the distribution of the benefits of hard work in the shop floor was unsustainable and untenable and a hindrance to growth, because it's not right that productivity is a firm level thing. So a firm flourishes or a firm doesn't flourish. So how come at the end of that process, it's obviously not an optimal process where the benefits of that and the benefits of our competitiveness, which Anne completely correctly highlighted, we have to be competitive, we have to find our way in the world economy, but we're not going to do that unless we can actually deal with the distorted relations in our workplace. They stifle growth. So that's not solving the unemployment problem, but it is saying that our growth strategy and our inequality and what's going on in our workplaces, we do need to give consideration to that. A quick point, there's a hard end about policy now, not so much about the economy, but about policy. The focus on inequality and growth and poverty and inequality in a sort of a national coalition or a national or a social compact. Some people have talked about it. Some people speak about the grand bargain. If you look at the reality of that based on your experiences around the world, it's very tough on the policy milieu. It doesn't mean a big flabby state that's going to do a whole lot of things. If you're really directed at this thing, it means a very, very focused state. So everything that Anne said, and Imran was agreeing about, we do want an efficient state that's focused and knows what it's doing, and it's part of all hands on deck to build a citizenry that can be very productive, that are the basis for a successful growth process. And particularly in the current environment, when none of us, I think, are wishing away the stringent fiscal crisis that we're in. It makes it even more important that we know what we're prioritizing, what are we not prepared to forego currently, right now. And I think that a growth process requires, and our inequality process requires, and our poverty process requires, that we absolutely need a healthy, well-educated citizenry living in safe circumstances, able to work and able to get to work. And we need to focus our infrastructure and we need to focus our schooling and our health on that. And in that moment, we need to demand of our state that they prioritize and deliver what's required to be part of an inclusive growth strategy.
Professor Murray Leibrand, thank you very much indeed. Right, we're going to take questions from the floor. I'm going to ask someone to just come and take the microphone to pass it round. I'm afraid, and I've been told and I've been given full license to be ruthless here, it's questions, not points, okay? So put the point in a question if you can. I can see we have someone already got their hand up over there in the middle, right in the middle of that side. If we can pass the microphone, in fact, it's coming to you. We'll ask you just to state your name as well, please, and who you're putting the question to, if it is to one person.
Good evening. I'm putting the question to the panel. Where would a basic income grant fit into the scheme of things in alleviating poverty in South Africa?
Good question. Who would like to start?
So I'm not an advocate of a basic income grant, and that's for two reasons really. I think it's a kind of policy that would require a large amount of resources that I don't think we have, and I think lots of the debate in the north is being kind of projected onto countries like ours, and kind of hiding in that is a larger question about distributions and incomes between the North and the South. So I think with the technology changes we're seeing, I think it raises for me much more important questions about how the North lives in kind of relationship to the South. But I think there's a wider issue about I'm not at the stage where I subscribe to the view that technology is going to change, that we're not going to have. I do think technology is going to change things, but the kind of history is one where it kind of changes jobs. Some die, but you have lots of new jobs emerging, and I think we're still going to be doing work for a long, long time.
Anyone else? Thank you. We'll come to you, Prof. All right, other questions, please. Yes, ma'am, over there. Where's the microphone's over there with the, it's a lovely pink scarf, if I may say. It might not be pink, my wife will know which one it is.
Thank you. My question is to the panelists. I'd like to know what role they think that unions, as the representatives of the insiders, play in jobs and growth and ultimately the high unemployment and inequality we have in South Africa.
I'm guessing, but I think Anne Bernstein might have a view.
Look, let me make it, I'm in favor of democratic organization and people having the right to organize themselves in unions and in any other way. So our position is not one of opposition to trade unions. What's happened in South Africa because of our history is that we're in this very difficult situation where unions fought very hard to get standards and wages higher during and after apartheid, and rightly so. But what's happened is it's raised the barriers, not intentionally, but it's raised the barriers for millions and millions of people, the rural African female, who cannot get into this labor market because the floor is too high. So we certainly want an economy where you can have people operating in different sectors. So you could be a unionized worker in the motor industry, and you should bargain as hard as possible to get whatever you can. On the other hand, we should open a portal for more labor-intensive industries where the wages can be lower, because in many ways the biggest step forward in terms of inequality would be to get the 4.5 out of 10 people who don't have a job into employment. Because if they're only earning 2,000 or 2,500, boy, that's going to drive our inequality figures in a much better direction. That's not great, but that's a much better place to start. So this isn't an anti-union position at all. It's one that says the people making, I don't know, Imran's suit should be unionized and have the capacity to organize and have the standards and the wages they can push for. But the person making a very, very basic T-shirt doesn't have that kind of bargaining power. In time, those factories will unionize. So China, these people were earning very little, and over the last 15, 20 years, those workers in factories have unionized and driven up wages quite dramatically, in fact, and that's why so many people are moving out of China to start firms in Bangladesh or in Cambodia or Ethiopia. So it's not an anti-union position, and as a Democrat, I think people have every right to organize.
We've got literally 50 seconds left on the TV broadcast. Prof, are you able to give us your response in 50 seconds?
So I think your question speaks to this, to the narrative that what we have in South Africa is an insider-outsider problem. That some of us are inside and some of us are outside. I think that's a deeply problematic way to see the society, because what we're saying when we say that is that the worker who's kind of earning 2,500, spending 2,000 rand to get to work, we're saying to her, you're an insider, and that you're responsible for the fact that someone who's on the outside doesn't have a job. And for me, that's a deeply problematic way to think about it.
So sorry. All right, this has been a live broadcast of the Full View here on SABC News. The conversation will continue on Twitter, of course. There are various conversations around this that will continue. I'd like to thank my guests, Anne Bernstein from the Centre for Development and Enterprise, Professor Imran Valodia from Wits University, Mamaketi Dejane from Absa, Professor Murray Leibrand from UCT. The conversation will continue here. Nzinga Kunta is waiting for you in Auckland Park. Nzinga. Prof, would you like to give a longer answer?
I sort of do think that this point is really, I think, what the debate's about, right? We kind of have a narrative that says that kind of, if you happen to be an insider and we classify an insider to kind of include someone who's really earning a wage that is way below the breadline. And we're saying to that person, kind of, you are the reason why someone who doesn't have a job doesn't have a job. I think it's a much more complex situation than that. I think we're in a situation where we're going to have to make some hard choices. I think we're all going to have to make some tough trade-offs, and we're all going to have to make some kind of pretty serious sacrifices. But the kind of sacrifice we're asking someone who's earning 2,500 to make seems to me to be an unfair kind of ask. How about this for another way to think about it? Let's go to the ShopRite example that I gave. How about the CEO of ShopRite saying, I don't need 33 million per year. I'm happy to live on 3 million, which is more than enough that kind of anyone has kind of really needs to live on. And then let's talk about how we deal with those trade-offs and kind of how we bring some of those who don't have work into the labor market. But it seems to me pretty unfair to lay the blame kind of at one point without dealing with those who earn a massive amount, without dealing with those who earn who can't own 95% of the assets.
All right, next questions. We have one in the front. I'm looking for the person with the microphone. Shall we come to the front? It says obey on your shirt, right?
It says obey. Gift Ribelli here from Kudoti. My question is to Anne. You speak about reintroducing unskilled jobs in the economy to cater for the many unemployed in South Africa. What I gather is about 56% of employment comes from firms who are... Okay, sorry. I was saying that what I gather is 56% of most of the employment within the country comes from firms, corporates, and they are built on legacy systems that in the past were allowing these unskilled individuals to come in. To add that up, in less than 3,000 days, I think the African continent will be home to more young people than any other place in the world. And these come with sort of a new, I think, skill. How do you, in your opinion, see us introducing or reintroducing these unskilled, very low jobs in this futuristic path that we are trying to take?
Well, thanks for the question, an important point. I'm not sure I heard everything. Let me explain what I think, and then see if I've answered the question. Apartheid was a terrible system, and workers were exploited. They weren't allowed to organize as trade unions until the 1980 and into the 80s. And people had terrible education, and they were denied access to the city through the pass laws and so on. So I am certainly not in favor of that. What we're saying is that in our democracy, firstly, we should improve people's education. It's outrageous that nearly 80% of our schools, according to the government, are dysfunctional. Not me. And we've made little improvements in the last few years, but they're not really significant. So fixing the education of the vast majority of people so they get as decent an education as I did in a government school or wherever else is absolutely vital to changing things. Secondly, workers now have the right to organize. And we're certainly not saying that we should take away rights from anybody who has them. We're not saying that. We're saying that in a situation which is, as the professor said, is globally unprecedented, our youth unemployment rate, where people through no fault of their own go to a terrible school, they live far from, the outskirts of the city, or they live in a rural area, they're far away from anything happening, not their fault, and they can't get into the job market, okay? And transport's expensive, which I think I agree, this is one of the top priorities for the country. Transport should be much more affordable for poorer people, public transport. So how do we get them, not just talk, how do we get beyond where we are now? And if you look around the world, one of the big differences between South Africa and other countries, developing countries, countries that were poorer than us, countries that also are unequal and have had colonial histories and all sorts of things, but you look at it, and it's not just China. First everyone said, oh, that's just Hong Kong. You had sweatshops, so-called, and then they start, they move up and up and up, and now they're a sort of global financial center. Then they said, oh, no, South Korea, the special circumstances. Taiwan, special circumstances. Then China, oh, special circumstances. So let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam has adopted a policy of going for an efficient state, and they're going gung-ho for a competitive economy originally based on, let's call them low-skill, low-wage jobs, okay? But nobody's staying there. If you do it well, you move up the firms and the people. And South Africa's saying, because of our history, and I understand, not for us. Thanks very much. We don't want to do that. We somehow want to leapfrog a young woman who's come out of a bad school in a sort of orange farm or in a rural area. We want to leapfrog her into the fourth industrial revolution. Well, dream on. That's why we have the worst unemployment rate possible. And we're saying the only thing we can think of, not perfect, not pretty, but every other country is doing this. I've been to Ethiopia. This is one of the poorest countries in the world. In the middle of nowhere, they are getting global companies to come and set up factories. The wages are low, but they'll explain to you, we don't have a real workforce. People have never worked before. Once they become a more efficient, productive workforce, we will pay more. And, the experience of China is it's disproportionately women who work in these factories. They stay about 6 or 7 years, and they don't describe this as exploitation. They see it as, gee, how am I going to get that person's job because they're getting a bit more money than me? How am I going to be a manager in the factory? How am I going to save a little bit of money so I can start a little firm that services the next round of workers? Or go home to a rural area where I'm not oppressed by my husband, my father, my brother. I'm going to be the one with a little bit of power, and I'm going to do something different. I don't see what choice we have. And people might not like what we're saying, but we've tried it. There is no alternative. But you've got to, at the same time, fix education. So people are more like me and you, and we've got choices of jobs.
So on the issue of the fourth industrial revolution and the skills mix, etc., we cannot have an economy that we want. We can only have the economy that we have. We cannot have the workforce that we want. We have the workforce that we have. So I've heard quite a bit of criticism about this idea about what are you going to do with all these unemployed people in the fourth industrial revolution, etc. As far as I understand right now, this minute, there's still a lot of people who work in factories. So factories might be eventually are going to die out, but I don't get a sense that they're dying out right now. So for me, I'm with Imran. Jobs are still there, and until they're not there. And for the time being, they're there. There's a lot of forecast about when they're going to die, but they haven't died yet. So I think we need to work with what we've got, which is the reality at the moment. And the fact that we would like a more skilled workforce does not change the fact that we don't have that. So we can really only work with the workforce that we have. The one thing I think that is critical that has come up is around the social wage. So what kind of healthcare does government provide? Transport infrastructure, education infrastructure. That is all the things that government can provide. That would definitely lower the cost of living for people. So when I say 2,500 rand, of course, if you have cheap transport, it's different when you're like spending 2,000 rand of that money on transport. The other thing that we haven't spoken about today, at any point today, is spatial planning. So, and I've made so much noise about this. My opinion is that the land where Waterfall currently sits, that entire area should never have been turned into high-income building. It should have actually been reserved for low-income workers. Because that way you cut people's transport, they're closer to work, you could densify it, you could have accommodated a lot of people in that space, instead of like putting more millionaires on little plots of land for goodness knows what reason, as if they couldn't have lived somewhere else. So those are the kinds of decisions. When I say a lot of these are political decisions, this is a decision that is taken by the city council to say this is what we're going to do, which does not take into account the needs of the people inside the country. So if you look at people that are employed that are low income workers, there's a lot of ways in which you can assist them without passing the cost necessarily completely to firms. When it comes to the inequality in pay, that's another political decision that sits a little bit elsewhere as well. It's around why is it that you allow companies to pay themselves what they pay themselves, and this whole primacy of shareholders as if they are bigger people than other people. That's another debate. But the debate about whether firms, and when you speak about, also we speak about small businesses. Small businesses are a huge thing in this country. Small businesses cannot pay the wages that big businesses can. So how do you dismantle that whole infrastructure to make the sectors more competitive? One of the ways in which you do it is to not create these massive wage barriers for small businesses that would be willing to hire people and people would be willing to work. So I think we're conflating all sorts of issues. It's like, oh, this is like inequality, and just if you take every little thing and take it bite-sized pieces and deal with each issue in turn, even though they're all interconnected, you might get a little bit further.
It's a question of the light fiction.
Good evening. Professor Imran, I'd like to ask you a question in your academic capacity. There seems, at least to my mind, something very peculiar about economics, or economics the way it's taught in our mainstream universities, like the one that you are part of the leadership of, or the many other world-class institutions we have in this country. And what makes me say that is that we seem, on the one hand, incredibly capable of churning out economists that can make gazillions for Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, insert the name of any investment bank. Yet on the other hand, such an inability to create the social scientists that we need to be able to create the practical, actionable solutions that we need for a society. And if you agree with the premise, what can be done to improve economics to make it more responsive to society?
I'm going to ask you to respond to that.
So I'm not sure that I kind of agree with you. If I look at the whole of the economics profession, I think there's a kind of really fantastic set of kind of interesting ideas that give us tremendous insights into how the world works and what are the types of policies that we should follow to make the world a place that we would all be happier about. You know, in many of the top schools around the world, you have a very diverse set of professors. I'd like to think that here at WITS, and I think at many of the South African universities as well, we kind of have a tremendous amount of diversity, interesting ideas. I mean, my own personal interest in kind of economics stems from wanting to understand gender in our economy a lot better. And there's a whole branch of economics which looks at gender, which gives us a much more complete sort of picture of the world. You sort of build in things like unpaid work, etc. I think the problem is that there's one view of kind of economics which I think tends to transfer from the universities into the banks and the kind of stockbrokers and into the practice in the economy. And I think we need to think more about how we train our students in a way where when they make that transition, they remember that the economy is a lot more complex than simply markets operating efficiently. Most of what we teach them is that markets do work, but there's large amounts of markets that don't work, and large amounts of the theory which don't really apply in that way. So for me, the kind of problem's not kind of inside the university, it's with that transference from the university into practice.
Pass it on to the other professor and see what UCT has to say.
So I think that it's unfair that the economists have to solve the problem. It's not just an economic problem. I think where you've got a great point, that really is a challenge to us in South Africa, not just in the way we train economists, but in what we are, is that to crack the South African problem is going to require extremely innovative thinking. So it's not actually going to be solved by finding the right economic training in a sense of. So I agree with what Imran said. We train economists in a way that they're not very good at sorting out market failures. So that's a very good point. But it's not, we do need economists to be very, very well trained in the current moment so that they can bring the economic toolkit. I don't think we can solve the market failures that we've been talking about tonight by classic economic tools. I think it's a broader menu of tools. I think we must make sure that we're demanding of ourselves, that we train our students and we train ourselves to address the issues of the day. But the state of the discipline internationally is that there's this expression called country specificity. What it means is that there's no ideological thing that you can plonk on top of the situation and you've sorted your problems out. And I think we suffer from a problem with that in the country on all poles. And I don't think that economists on their own are part of are going to crack this thing. I guess my point earlier about the fact that we need to embrace our social project and bring the best that we have to offer to that project is what we've got to do. Let me just slide in a point I wanted to make anyway, which is a bit disingenuous. But, I mean, it strikes me that, for example, if you think about economic growth, predominantly you've got to have investment to drive growth. It's a macroeconomic thing. We haven't had any macro discussion this evening, just about nothing. And so the burden has fallen on the explanation about how the wage can sort out our unemployment problem. Well, it's certainly got something to do with the unemployment problem. No economist of any ideological persuasion would think otherwise. But we haven't discussed the fact that even there is money to invest in South Africa. South Africans themselves have surplus capital, if you like, that they're not investing in their society. And what we're told about that is that we don't have a sort of a stable policy milieu. We don't have a stable society. There is a subtlety and a broad recognition in the business community that we need to know where we're going as a society. So we haven't had any discussion about that tonight. We need to attract foreign investment. The foreign investors tell us very, very clearly and explicitly that they're as interested in the stability and the sustainability of the society as, you know, in order to grow, in order for them to put their money here, as they are in the sort of the short-term profits, or, you know, obviously if we threaten their ability to repatriate profits, we're going to get into trouble. But there's a broader social project here that's completely on point for tonight. And so we do need our economists to be really good, but the economists aren't going to crack that on their own because it's a social project. Yeah, so don't be unfair to the economists, but do demand a lot of us to be world class.
Okay, we've literally got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go all the way to the back, if I can. Two people sitting next to each other. I'm going to take one in the black. Okay.
Hello, my name is Nongyebo. I just wanted to find out, don't you think it's important for us to develop maybe growth models that are, I should stand up, okay. Sorry. Don't you think it's important for us to develop growth models that are maybe, that address South African variables or determinants? I feel like the growth models that we use are models that have been developed by economists that are using models or like a blanket or mirror structure of Western principles. Are there certain growth models that we can implement that can incorporate our history, the variables or determinants that we have that are specific to South African and African problems? Do we have growth models like that? Why are we not utilizing them? Why are we specific to using decisions that happen at the World Economic Forum, and we sit there and take the principles and the models that are given to us and implement them to African or South African problems?
So I'm not necessarily an economist, but I'm going to address the economist issue because I work with a lot of economists and I work in a bank. And I'm a quasi-economist myself. And I think, firstly, the question, there's two levels of that it's unfair, the criticism. Firstly is that economists don't make political decisions. And policy is inherently a political decision. So economists can only get so far. And then beyond that, the politicians have got to make decisions, and then the decisions then come back into the economy. So I don't know that it's not true that South Africa doesn't get good advice, because I think there is an element, there's a lot of good advice, there's a lot of good work that's been done. I mean, going back to your point around building models that are specific to South Africa, I think South African economists do work on South African problems from a South African perspective across all economic departments, because it would not make sense not to do that. But economists can only get it so far. So at the end of the day, there is a lot of political contestation. The space is contested from an ideological perspective, and I think we might overstate that a little bit. But more importantly, there are lots of vested interests in the system, and the vested interests play the politics, and they try and get the outcomes that favor them. And the thing about it is that all of us have got to hold our politicians accountable. So if right now you have Cyril Ramaphosa who says, I'm going to deliver jobs, if after 5 years there are no jobs, are we going to, as a society, say, well, where are the jobs? Until you get more alignment between what the society wants and what the politicians do, we're going to be here in 10 years' time having this discussion, I think.
Probably going to only have time for one or two more questions after that.
So I want to respond to the essence of your question. My center does a lot of work on looking at the international experience, particularly developing countries, on what might be useful to think about for South Africa. Not models, but maybe lessons of what not to do, lessons of what might be working somewhere else, say in Brazil, say in India, say in Mexico, or Kenya, or wherever. So I think that's really important. South Africans need to really understand what's happening in our own country. What are the facts? What are the trends? And then we need to lift our heads and look at how other countries, particularly developing countries, which are often very similar. They have a small group of rich people, and they have lots of poorer people. And how are those countries dealt with some of the issues that we face, and is it helpful? So we're certainly not advocating, there's some answer out there. I'm with Murray Leibrand there. There isn't, quite clearly. But we can look at other countries which have got millions of people out of poverty, where something's worked, which are developing countries, are countries with rich people, small groups of rich people, and lots of poorer people. And so when I'm using the examples from China to Cambodia to these other places, let's look at what's happened there, and let's think about what we can learn that maybe we could try here. So for example, we're proposing an experiment. We're saying, how do we get beyond this endless debate? And so we've put up an experiment. We're suggesting South Africa takes Kruger in the Eastern Cape in Port Elizabeth, which is a special economic zone, which all of us have paid for already. But if you go and visit, there's a lot of open land there. It's not been a great success. And we're saying, take, for example, that area. Let's try out an export processing zone like Ethiopia is doing, like Cambodia. We're probably equivalent to the sort of wages we might be able to offer to the Philippines or Cambodia. Let's see if anyone will come and invest. We don't want subsidies. We just want to say, give us the freedom to experiment. And if it doesn't work, we'll eat our proverbial hats. But maybe it will. And maybe we can open a window for the kind of low-skilled jobs that young men and women desperately need, and that we have been killing over the last 20 years rather than expanding.
Right. Prof, I know you, Professor Leibrand, I know you want to speak. We're going to run out of time. I'm going to give everyone a chance everyone on the panel a chance for a last word. Last question of the night, please. Ask for it to be a question and not a point.
There's an elephant in the room, and I think we need to address that. On the side of poverty reduction, I think government is trying its damnedest best, issuing grants. And for my black folks, we have black tax. So as much as possible, we're trying to soften the blows. But the problem is this, on the inequality side, and that is why even next year, the Gini coefficient is going to be even worse, is that the private sector is perpetrating inequalities here. For people that are rich and people that are already drawing a lot of income, we heard of CEOs of certain companies, and we must be paying the same VAT with them. I think there's a problem. The question to Anne is this: is it not about time that perhaps we introduce a white tax? That is the elephant in the room. White people are earning so much more than black people, and that is where perpetration of inequality lies.
Okay, can I ask, just for clarity, you mean a white tax rather than a wealth tax?
Okay.
Or would you be happy with the wealth tax?
Let's use it interchangeably because
I'm sorry, let's use the?
I'm saying let's use it interchangeably.
Okay.
Because
which you could do economically. No, I get you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see if you
because when you're talking with the people, you're talking white people. That's the elephant in the room.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks.
Okay. White tax, but you can use it interchangeably as well. Are you prepared to respond and give your summation now as well, your final word, or do you want to go the other way around? Right. So then I'll ask people to answer that question as they sum up as well, Professor Leibrand. So this, I'm afraid, will be the last word, Professor Leibrand.
Yeah, good question. Next question. No. I was going to answer actually by saying that if there is serious discussion, and there needs to be serious discussion in South Africa about taxes other than income taxes, and and we do have the knowledge to design those taxes if we want to get there. So there's a big discussion within the Davis Committee right now about wealth taxes. So I think that that's the more productive way to go, because given the inequalities that we face in our country right now, and the racialized, as Stephen said right in the beginning, looking at the asset distribution and the wealth distribution and its role in the tax system will more substantively start addressing the way that race is persisting in the economy. So I guess that's my answer. Closing comments, I just wanted to endorse what Anne was saying about the fact that we do need to try and learn from all over the world. We need to get serious about this, guys. Right? This intersection of growth, poverty, and inequality. It's the biggest challenge that we have in our country. And so we can learn a lot from other places about being serious, for example, about water or transport or et cetera, but at the end of the day, the beautifully posed question at the end there about using the growth models from elsewhere. Actually, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the World Bank, they're the people telling South Africa that we've got the social sustainability problem, but they don't have any model. There aren't any models out there. It's our burden in this country, I think, to push that frontier.
So, you know, when I think the other thing that we didn't speak about, it was spoken about at some point quite briefly, is the issue that South Africa is, for good or ill, a member of the global financial market system. Not only are we a member, we're a highly indebted member that requires money from the global financial system on a daily basis. That runs into billions and billions of rands. And I think to some extent that creates a constraint around our policy options. So this idea that South Africa can go it alone and develop some policy path or whatever that the rest of the world does not understand and does not buy into is not going to fly. We cannot afford to do that even if we were that way inclined. So I think that's the one thing that we need to think about when we're thinking about investment, when we're thinking about keeping government open, keeping the lights on at Eskom, because we need global investors, and this is the position that we find ourselves in. Its effect on the ground, we cannot change it. And so to some extent, that does create some constraints around how we deal with any problem. And then the other thing is that I think from an investment perspective, going back to the economists at banks, etc., economists and the IMF and the World Bank and global investors, those people are equally worried about inequality, and they're equally worried about jobs because, like Mari said, it affects long-term sustainability. So there's not an us and a them. We might disagree a bit about how to deal with the issue, but we disagree a lot less than how it's made out when you read the press, etc. So I just wanted to give that that context as well.
Professor. So three quick points. I want to kind of answer the wealth, the wealth and the white tax thing. I think ownership and wealth patterns in South Africa have changed so dramatically that while it's true that we have a pattern of ownership that still has a big part of a sort of pattern of race, I think it's too simplistic to put it across as a black and white thing. The kind of group that has done the best out of the transition is kind of black South Africans who've moved up in the income distribution. So I don't see a case for a tax that would be sort of based on race. But I think there's kind of really good kind of arguments for a tax on wealth. Kind of interestingly, I think the kind of evidence is that we're not going to get a large amount of kind of income into the fiscus from it, but I think what it does is it kind of sets up an administration system that gives you information on the ownership of wealth, and I think that is a kind of really important thing. The second point I want to make is that I think we would all agree that the main thing that we have to deal with is to get this economy to grow. And I think I kind of agree with Anne and kind of everyone else on the panel that we've got a lot to learn from how other countries in the world have grown, and that there's a huge amount of information that we can get. We should absorb that and then apply those lessons to the context that we have to deal with. My kind of reading of that evidence is that it's possible to grow to kind of grow an economy in a way that kind of reduces inequality at the same time, and that if you don't do that, you're not going to get growth.
Let me end with 3 points. I agree with a lot of that, actually almost everything that people have said in this last round. I would say I'd like people to pay their tax, whether you're a big multinational, a big company, a very rich person, or me and anyone else. So we should pay our tax. Of course, SARS needs to be fixed, but one first step would be a serious commitment by all of us to pay our taxes into the public good. The second thing I want to talk about are cities. South Africa is nearly 70% urbanized, and the future of our country is going to be decided in the cities. Our economy and the jobs that we create are mainly created in some of our largest cities. And we don't talk enough about how we move away from the apartheid city. And we've got the slogans, but we've actually made things worse over the last 25 years because we've put housing settlements, because the land was cheap, far away from any economic opportunity, and then people are even more disadvantaged. So the cities and how we deal with the transport issue in the cities, especially for the poor, public transport, which is a disaster if you think of Cape Town and the whole country, but also how we get much more dense cities, so how we get more and more people close to economic opportunity, but with a secure place to stay. Lots to say on the cities in the growth debate and in the inequality debate. that most people don't talk about. And the last thing is to say that if I've achieved anything tonight, please go away and think about the outsiders and how you think they can get into this society much more effectively than we've been able to do. There isn't a perfect solution, but there are millions and millions of young people and older people who must live, and we know this from research, desperate lives with no hope. And so it's how we get them in to a much faster growing, more open economy, which does look very different from the one we've had before, which has to be much bigger, never mind anything else.
Right, well, I would like to thank everyone on our panel. I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to thank Anne Bernstein from the Center for Development and Enterprise Executive Director there. I'd like to thank Professor Imran Valodia, the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management at Wits, Mamoketi Dejane, Rates and Macro Strategist at ABSA, and Professor Murray Leybrandt, a Professor at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. Thank you all. I think they really do deserve a massive round of applause. And thank you for coming. I think the TV feed is finished, so I can tell you that SAFM is 105.1 in Joburg, and it's free. Thank you. Thank you very much.